Last year I wrote a video that I still stand by the basic concepts of, but I have since discovered a problem with how people see it. Language fucking sucks if we're completely honest with ourselves. It creates a gigantic moral problem, a base level, how do we exist decently question. It challenges the way we can interact with each other. Here's a sentence. I didn't kill her. Now, you know the definition of every single word in that sentence. So do I. However, the fact that I didn't kill her, I didn't kill her, I didn't kill her, and I didn't kill her all have completely different additional meanings speaks to the fact that language is a very fragile thing, and we tend to speak like sledgehammers. Context can very easily change meaning. That's before we get to people having different definitions of meanings for different words, either accidentally or purposefully. A perfect example of that. If you don't respect me, I won't respect you is a line often heard from figures abusing their authority. The reason the sentence is so nefarious is the dual meanings behind the word respect. They aren't saying, if you don't respect me as a human being, they won't respect as an authority. And what they continue to say is if you don't respect their authority, they won't respect your existence. I hear rather frequently the argument of gun control presented as an albeit simplistic logical step forward in safety. And while I want to scream about how openly racist the history of gun control has been, and we have to talk about that, we need to talk about that, but also we need to have a larger discussion about what gun control even is, what laws even are, and how we are viewing decent society. And let's start by talking about what gun control is. A definition I think a lot of people would agree with is it's a broad set of laws and regulatory measures meant to control access to private defense, including personal weapons. And yeah, that works, but it has a bunch of words inside of it that of themselves, how you define them will change how that definition works. The big one being, what is the law? How do you define law and what makes law? Well, there's the broader question of that we'll get to in a bit, but I think before we do that, it's worth discussing what the actual law has been, what is the laws of gun control in the United States. Now, the very first laws that are gun control laws, I'm not even going to repeat their name. The very first acts were a variety of states deciding that even if you were a former slave, if you're black, you don't need a gun. Populations in the U.S. not wanting the slaves they just bought to get guns and ideas formulate specific bans preventing firearms from being owned by black people. During the American Revolution, we are fucking desperate. America's army is only as regulated as we allow it to be, basically. And that's not very. We try and push what we can, but realistically, it's a bunch of farmers who are desperately fighting for freedom, not so much for professionalism. And the goal is just winning by any means necessary. So we have black spies and black units. It's worth pointing out that even during the war, there were slave owners that were fighting the revolution. And in 1790, the militia standards reform took place that basically created a set of rigid standards for all of the militias that were going to be American militias. They're signed by Washington and agreed to by all of the states. And one of the requirements is that every person in the militia will be an 18 to 40-year-old, white, landowning male. And the thing is, lots of community defense at that time is the militia. So being banned from militias is frequently being banned from training. It's being banned from local gunsmiths. It is straight up a way to make it that only white people get access to firearms in parts of the country. However, there isn't that much in the way of gun control during the war. The main effort is the war itself, and most places are focusing on keeping their head down and trying to win. However, immediately after the Civil War, this idea begins to get pushed through. Good policing. See, when the Civil War ends, the concept of permits begin pretty much immediately. Multiple states decide that, okay, they're not going to ban all black people from owning firearms, but what they are going to do is create a series of black codes and create a series of restrictions, some of them open, some of them silent, some of them written down into the law, and others accepted by proxy. And one of the forms of control is, well, we're not trying to ban firearm possession per se. We're just... the police are going to be regulating that. We just want the police to be the ones who are in charge. And this is ignoring the fact that many of those police, they started as slave catching rings. They started as enforcement mechanisms of slavery. So asking them to evenly decide that the people they were just chasing and dehumanizing should have easy firearm access, it's laughable on its face. However, gun control measures largely fail at this point, and time continues on. During the advance of multiple civil rights movements, as well as the involvement of all black units during World War I, and importantly, the photographs of those units being very well publicized and spitting in the face of a lot of what the racist leaders had been saying about the actions of what minority communities were, gun control kind of fails. People aren't scared of each other, and they aren't thinking that the solution is stop each other from having the means of defense. That's not sensical. It clearly comes from an attempt to control someone rather than any sort of safety. It even says in the name, gun control. Now, the next measure that they attempt is the National Firearms Act in 1935. And it is worth knowing that while this gets passed, it's also gutted. It was originally an attempt to ban pistols and the open carry of most weapons for non-military and police. It was essentially going to be a ban on firearms. And the reason why it regulated short-barreled rifles and short-barreled shotguns was entirely so that you couldn't make those as a workaround for a pistol. It was not creating these additional categories because the categories themselves were dangerous. It was creating workarounds. It was creating a closing what they viewed as a loophole. However, the government almost immediately wishes that they had phrased it differently, because the very first thing that they do is sell a pile of M1 carbines, surplus M1s that had been left over from extra production after World War I, except they all had 16-inch barrels because that was a sensible barrel length. And the law said anything under an 18-inch barrel was a felony. So rather than cops to committing hundreds of thousands of major felonies, they just changed the law. And because of this, to this day, the NFA regulates shotguns as 18-inch devices. Below that, it is considered a short barrel shotgun. But for rifles, it is a 16-inch minimum. It's also worth knowing that part of the reason this failed is so many people had come back from either from a war or had bought from the war's end, from the military surplus, just guns that would be considered military firearms. And that language didn't scare people. They just knew that meant guns. In a lot of cases, that meant kind of shitty guns because it meant the military beat the fuck out of them first. And then, as if exemplary service during World War I wasn't enough, during World War II, you really had this giant push that cemented the beginning of the civil rights movement. You had fantastically brave soldiers who led the Bastards of Bastogne, the Tuskegee Airmen, these absolute legends with records that speak for themselves, heroes that committed acts of bravery that you and I will only dream of. And these are images that are given throughout America and legitimately help to begin the start of the civil rights movement. So when many of those soldiers come back, they begin fighting and peacefully marching and attempting to get the rights that so many have been fighting and dying for, only to have our government spit at them and treat them as garbage and like a threat, because our government is a hammer and it sees all problems as nails. When communities are not protected, they will protect themselves. This is one of the most famous pictures of Malcolm X, and first of all, I'd like to point out the sheer levels of fucking drip that this man had. But also this photo and the photos like it coming from the Black Panthers of volunteers arming themselves in order to protect their community was enough to scare and organize hate into pushing gun bans. After those pictures came out, Ronald Reagan began hard campaigning. A famous quote from him: "There is absolutely no reason why out on the street today a civilian should be carrying a loaded weapon." Ronald Reagan in 1967. This is why I never understood why any gun people who were into like Reagan, like, in what universe is he for your rights? He openly spits at the Second Amendment whenever he can because he wants to spit at black people and sees the Second Amendment as the thing standing in the way. Because in 1967, he passes the Mulford Act in California. The Mulford Act bans a bunch of weapons, creates gun registries, and creates background check requirements. He follows this up by pushing for a National Gun Control Act in 1968. The Gun Control Act adds background checks for every firearm purchase and basically makes every FFL suddenly able to tell anyone of any minority group, fuck off. The people who push the act are not subtle about it. Direct quote from one of the lead activists pushing it at the time: "Congress passed the act to shut off weapons access to blacks." And this brings us back to a really fundamental question. What is the law? How do you define what the law is? A lot of people would come up with a relatively simple definition. Laws are, I don't know, it's the things that we all agree on and then we write them down, and that's what a law is. I can understand where people would think that, but I would like to point out that there are a large number of things that get written down and we agree to, but no matter how much it is agreed to and written down, it doesn't matter if you violate that law because nobody's going to enforce it. I will admit I have a fairly large pirate server that I watch movies on. There's a bunch of movies I want to watch that it doesn't matter what streaming service I paid for, there is no access for me anymore. I have bought it before as physical medium and I refuse to not have access to it, so I have a pirated copy of it. The FBI is never going to come bust down my door, even though, as this shitty ad campaign told us all, piracy is a crime. It is a federal crime. But if nobody is going to arrest me for breaking this law, what matter was the law? H.L.A. Hart, a philosopher, goes into the concepts from this. In his definition, there are two main forms of law. There is the primary law of the universe. That is the law that decides what you can and can't do. I can drink this. I can't take that. I can shoot you. I can't shoot you. The secondary laws are the things that modify our primary laws. Carrying a badge, getting married, gender transitions. These are things that alter your state of primary law. However, according to him, there is a deeper law that supersedes all of that. And this is the thing that really determines what law is. It's the rule of recognition. Law is what we recognize is law. That might seem kind of circular. It's because it is. But it kind of points to the idea that law is a far more malleable thing than many of us want it to be. That the intentions behind a law will frequently not be the impacts of the law. Stonewall was an anti-police riot. one, the law itself was not a moral or ethical or legal representation of anything. It was straight up a reflection of hate and wanting to shit on queer people. In New York, the way the law was phrased, it was shitting on queer men specifically, which is part of why when a lesbian was being arrested for the same law, and I say that with the giant fucking air quotes, and she turned and screamed at a bunch of drag queens, "Why aren't you doing something?" They all realized in that moment the reason she was getting arrested was society had just recognized law was just whatever the cops said it was law. That was how the law was recognized. But if they all didn't recognize it, if they all looked at the cops and picked up bricks rather than cowered in fear, the law was not necessarily whatever the pigs wanted it to be. The law was what they recognized it to be. And this created the basis of all queer rights movements in the US from that point forward. Which brings us back to the question, what is the law? In a lot of cases, unfortunately, the law is what the police decide the law is. The police get to decide in that moment whether or not this is the law. And even if they get it wrong, you deal with the consequences. Anybody who is from any minority community can speak to the fact that there are ways that your community can be profiled by the police. It is not a thing that has just been magically fixed. The FBI released a report in 2006 detailing how white supremacist movements had been infiltrating law enforcement for a long time, that there were entire police departments that were nothing but hate group. That had the entire chain of command controlled by the KKK. And frankly, that tracks with anybody who knows about our history as a country. We have a long and terrifying history of our police siding with hate, and our law essentially being a tool that law enforcement gets to use. The definition for gun control that I presented earlier was a broad set of legislative and regulatory measures meant to control access to private defense, including personal weapons. And I think that is being charitable with the language to the detriment of the person who is trying to understand the meaning. I would argue a more accurate set of the true intention of gun control is this definition: a broad set of legislative measures meant to control access to community building for non-police approved communities. And if you ever need proof of this, or if you ever find yourself thinking that perhaps we should model the UK, for example, their method of gun control. Over the past few decades, but the statistics I've brought up are for the past few years, the UK has had a higher hate crime rate than the US, specifically when it comes to anti-queer hate crimes. I didn't misspeak there, by the way. That's not per capita. Per capita, it's about 5 times worse, but just on the data alone, it is higher. The numbers are higher. Now, that part of that is their reporting metrics are different, but a big part of that is the U.S. does not have an acid attack problem. There is always, in all of our minority communities, the chance that those who are being attacked are armed. When you see the hateful attacks, and we have to have conversations as a country about culture, about the way that we push hate, the way that we spread misinformation. But one common thing you will see among the people who commit hateful attacks, they have to armor themselves because there is a very, very reasonable chance that the community will be able and ready to meet such hate. I need to give a quick shout out to PhilosophyTube. She has a great video. I highly recommend watching a bunch of her content, but specifically the How the Police Make the Law video was an inspiration for a big part of this. I highly recommend going and watching that. And the answer that she gives at the end of her presentation is maybe the answer is make laws more vague. And there's some argument there. I can understand where that's coming from. But I would like to posit that in this area specifically, when discussing gun control, that perhaps the answer is less vague laws and more vague definitions. When you make gun control a legal tool, all that does is make it a tool for law enforcement. However, we as a culture need to be having bigger conversations about toxicity, about queerness and minority group access to rights, about gun safety, about mental health care access, about how we want to treat those who have the least. But none of those conversations will be had if all we do is give cops a bigger stick to beat people with. Thank you all for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you want to support me making more content like this, I'm over on Patreon, patreon.com/queerarmorer. All of these people have given a little bit a month in order for me to be able to make content like this, and it means the fucking world. You get access to all of these videos early, and perhaps more importantly, you get access to all of these videos early, and I get the chance to continue doing this as a focus of mine. In the future, I'm going to be setting up more votes on content that I have somewhat finished so that people can pick what the next content will be. And I hope that you will come along and vote for some of it too. That's going to be it from me. Stay dangerous, y'all. Keep each other safe. And remember, moral doesn't mean legal, and Stonewall was a riot. Peace.